I haven't been touched in 8 years, the billionaire said, then kissed the obese virgin. He's one of the richest men alive, powerful, cold, and untouchable since the day his wife died. She's a shy, plus-sized woman who's never been kissed, just trying to make a living as his cook. But when their worlds collide, one simple touch changes everything. What starts as a quiet job in a lonely mansion turns into something no one expected. A broken man's confession, a woman's fight to be seen, and a love the world refuses to understand. As gossip spreads and secrets from the past surface, both of them are forced to face a painful truth. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't falling in love. It's believing you deserve it. He's haunted by guilt. She's terrified of rejection. So when the cameras close in and the world laughs at their love, will he hide again in silence? Or will one kiss be enough to prove that even the untouchable can be saved? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Steam rose from the pot of hearty beef stew as Georgia Holloway stirred it with practiced care. The rich aroma of herbs and slow-cooked meat filled the community center's humble kitchen, bringing a small smile to her face. She'd added extra vegetables, just like her grandmother taught her, to make sure the veterans got a proper, nourishing meal. "Bless their hearts," she murmured, ladling generous portions into bowls. Her arms ached from hours of cooking, but seeing the grateful faces of the veterans made it all worthwhile. The serving line moved steadily as she worked, her gentle, "Here you go, sugar," and "God bless you," accompanying each bowl she handed out. But then she heard them. Those whispered words that cut like knives coming from a cluster of church ladies hovering near the dessert table. "Look at her serving all that food when she should be on a diet herself." One woman snickered, not quite quietly enough. "I heard Pastor Jim's wife say her size is becoming an embarrassment to the church." Another added with mock concern, "Well, what do you expect? She probably samples everything she cooks." Georgia's hand trembled slightly as she continued ladling stew, her chest tightening with each cruel word. She'd known these women for years, had cooked for their children's baptisms, their wedding anniversaries. The betrayal stung worse than the insults. She blinked rapidly, willing the tears not to fall. Not here, not now. The veterans didn't deserve to have their meal service disrupted by her hurt feelings. So she did what she'd always done, smiled through the pain, and kept serving. "Would you like some more cornbread, sir?" she asked an elderly veteran in a wheelchair, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. The event seemed to stretch on forever, but finally the last bowl was served and the cleanup began. Georgia was just finishing loading the dishwasher when her phone buzzed. A text from Pastor Jim. "Please stop by my office before you leave." The walk to the church next door felt like marching to her own execution. She'd been catering church events for 8 years. Surely the gossip hadn't gotten that bad. But deep down, she knew what was coming. Pastor Jim's office was warm and familiar, filled with books and family photos. But today it felt cold and foreign. He couldn't quite meet her eyes as she settled into the chair across from his desk. "Georgia," he began, fingers fidgeting with a pen. "You know how much we value your service to the church." Her heart sank. She'd heard enough corporate training videos to recognize what came after that kind of opening. "But," she prompted quietly. He sighed heavily. "But some concerns have been raised by certain board members about maintaining a professional image in our church functions." Georgia sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. "Because of my weight." "Now, Georgia." He looked uncomfortable. "It's not just that. Some feel that as the face of our church catering services, we need someone who projects a more health-conscious image." The words hit her like physical blows. each one confirming what that critical voice in her head, the one that sounded so much like her mother, had always said, "You're not good enough. You'll never be good enough." "I understand," she said softly, though her heart was breaking. "I'll finish out the month's commitments." "Actually," Pastor Jim shifted in his seat, "the board thinks it's best if we make the change immediately. We'll pay you through the month, of course." Georgia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She gathered her purse and stood, her legs feeling wooden. "Georgia," Pastor Jim called as she reached the door. "I'm sorry. I truly am." The drive home was a blur of streetlights and unshed tears. Her small apartment welcomed her with silence and shadows. In the kitchen, she mechanically pulled out a container of leftover stew, the same recipe she'd served tonight, and ate it straight from the container, not bothering to heat it up. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, as clear as if the woman was standing right there. "If you'd just lose the weight, Georgia, you might find yourself a man. No one wants a woman who can't control herself." The cold stew turned to ash in her mouth. She set down her fork and pushed the container away, suddenly unable to take another bite. Doing what she'd done every night since she was a little girl, Georgia lowered herself to her knees beside her bed. "Lord," she whispered, her voice catching, "I don't understand your plan right now, but I trust you. Please, please just show me what to do next." As if in answer, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. With trembling fingers, she opened the new email. "Urgent placement opportunity. Private chef position. Temporary contract location. Coastal estate. Client. High-profile individual. Immediate start required competitive compensation." Georgia stared at the screen, her heart beating faster. She'd registered with the employment agency months ago, almost as an afterthought, never expecting anything to come of it. "Lord," she whispered again, this time with a hint of wonder in her voice, "if this is you, if this is your way of leading me, I'll go." She took a deep breath and clicked reply, her finger hovering over the keyboard for just a moment before she began to type. Sometimes, she reflected, when one door closes, God doesn't just open a window. He opens the whole wall. Maybe, just maybe, this was her moment to walk through it. The morning sun painted Georgia's small bedroom in gentle stripes through the Venetian blinds. She stood before her open closet, carefully selecting what to pack. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded her best black slacks and crisp white blouses into the weathered suitcase that had belonged to her grandmother. "Lord," she whispered, smoothing a wrinkle from a sleeve, "I sure hope you know what you're doing with this one." Her fingers brushed against her favorite apron, white cotton with tiny red cherries embroidered along the hem. It was worn at the edges but spotlessly clean. She'd sewn up a small tear last month, determined to make it last another year. Now she folded it carefully on top of her clothes. Last but never least, she picked up her Bible from the nightstand. The leather cover was soft and creased from years of daily reading, its pages marked with colorful tabs and underlined verses. She tucked it securely between layers of clothing. "Well," she said to her reflection in the mirror, "I guess this is what starting over looks like at 46 years old." She attempted a smile, but it came out wobbly. Loading her ancient Toyota Corolla took just 2 trips. The suitcase, a box of essential cooking tools she couldn't bear to leave behind, and her purse. The car grumbled to life on the 3rd try, as though sharing her reluctance to leave the familiar behind. The GPS guided her out of the city and onto winding coastal roads. Trees grew thicker, houses grew larger, and her nervousness grew stronger with each mile. "What in the world am I doing?" she asked aloud, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Cooking for a billionaire? Me?" A burst of nervous laughter escaped her. "Lord, you must have quite the sense of humor. I mean, What does a billionaire even eat? Caviar for breakfast, gold-plated steaks. The road curved sharply, revealing glimpses of ocean between the trees. Georgia's breath caught at the beauty of it, sunlight dancing on the waves far below. At least the view's nice, she murmured. Though I suppose that's not much comfort if I mess this up spectacularly. After another 15 minutes of increasingly exclusive neighborhoods, the GPS announced her arrival. Georgia pulled up to an imposing iron gate set into a stone wall that stretched as far as she could see in both directions. A security camera swiveled to focus on her car. "Hello?" she called uncertainly toward the intercom panel. "I'm Georgia Holloway, the new chef?" The gate swung open silently. Georgia drove through, following a winding driveway that seemed to go on forever. When the house finally came into view, she had to remind herself to keep breathing. Mansion was too modest a word for it. The structure before her looked like something out of a movie, all glass and stone and sharp angles, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. It was beautiful in a cold, untouchable way, like a sculpture in an art museum. As Georgia parked in the circular driveway, the front door opened. A tall, thin woman with steel-grey hair pulled into a severe bun emerged. She wore a charcoal grey dress and practical shoes, and her expression suggested she'd just bitten into something sour. "Ms. Holloway?" The woman's voice matched her appearance, crisp and no-nonsense. "I am Mrs. Brigham, the housekeeper. Please follow me." Georgia grabbed her cooking tools and hurried to keep up with Mrs. Brigham's brisk pace. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate—" "Your belongings will be taken to your quarters," Mrs. Brigham interrupted, leading her through the front door. "First, you must learn the rules." The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than the exterior. Every surface gleamed with a perfection that seemed almost artificial. Their footsteps echoed on marble floors, and Georgia felt suddenly very aware of her practical shoes and simple clothes. "The kitchen is this way?" Mrs. Brigham continued, leading her through a series of rooms that felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was arranged just so, but nothing felt lived in. No magazines left open, no coffee cups on tables, no signs of actual life. The kitchen, when they reached it, was a chef's dream, all stainless steel and state-of-the-art equipment. But like the rest of the house, it felt untouched, as though no one had ever actually cooked there. "Mr. Thorne takes his meals in the dining room at 7 o'clock in the morning, 12:30 in the afternoon, and 6 o'clock in the evening," Mrs. Brigham recited. "You will prepare the meals and leave them on the table. Under no circumstances are you to remain in the dining room or attempt to interact with Mr. Thorne directly." Georgia nodded, trying to take it all in. "Does Mr. Thorne have any particular preferences or dietary restrictions I should know about?" "He eats whatever is served," Mrs. Brigham replied flatly. "Though I would suggest avoiding anything too experimental. Mr. Thorne appreciates consistency." The tour continued through what felt like endless rooms, each as perfect and lifeless as the last. Mrs. Brigham pointed out the service stairs, the laundry facilities, the staff entrance she was to use, and finally her quarters, a surprisingly comfortable suite with its own small sitting room and bathroom. "Your personal effects will be here shortly," Mrs. Brigham said. "Dinner service begins in 3 hours. Do you have any questions?" Georgia had about 1,000 questions, but something told her Mrs. Brigham wasn't the person to ask. "No, ma'am, thank you." Left alone in the kitchen, Georgia took a deep breath and rolled up her sleeves. "Well, Lord," she murmured, tying on her cherry print apron. "I guess it's just you and me now." She opened the industrial-sized refrigerator and found it fully stocked with premium ingredients. After some consideration, she decided to start with what she knew best, a hearty beef stew with fresh vegetables and herbs, the kind that could warm both body and soul. As she worked, she hummed old hymns under her breath, the familiar motions of chopping and stirring helping to calm her nerves. The kitchen gradually filled with the rich aroma of simmering stew. At precisely 6 o'clock, Georgia ladled the stew into a bowl, arranged fresh-baked rolls on a plate, and carried everything to the dining room. The massive table could have seated 20, but only one place was set. At the head of the table, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows and the darkening ocean beyond. Before leaving, she paused. "Lord," she whispered, "bless this food to the nourishment of body and soul, and maybe bless whoever's eating it too." That night, after returning to her quarters, Georgia tried not to worry about whether the mysterious Mr. Thorne would like her cooking. She distracted herself with unpacking, arranging her few belongings in the spacious drawers and closets. The next morning, she arrived early in the kitchen to prepare breakfast. To her surprise, the bowl from the previous night's dinner sat in the dish rack, scrubbed completely clean. Next to it on the counter was a plain white note card with 2 words written in precise handwriting. "Keep cooking." Georgia smiled, tucking the note into her apron pocket. Maybe, just maybe, this strange new chapter of her life would work out after all. Georgia settled into a routine over the next 3 days, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of cooking despite the strange emptiness of the mansion. Every morning, she'd arrive in the pristine kitchen before sunrise, switching on the lights that cast warm pools of gold across the stainless steel surfaces. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft whir of appliances and her own quiet humming of hymns. She noticed small signs of Elliot Thorne's presence, though she never saw him. A coffee cup left in the sink, footprints on the freshly mopped floor, or the sound of distant piano music late at night that would stop abruptly if she ventured too close. It was like living with a ghost, she thought, one who appreciated good food, at least, judging by the consistently empty plates that returned to the kitchen. Each meal she put extra care into the presentation, arranging everything just so on the formal china. Sometimes she'd leave. Little touches, a sprig of fresh herbs, or a note with the ingredients listed in her neat handwriting. She wasn't sure why she did it, except that it felt wrong to serve food without adding that personal warmth she'd always believed was essential to good cooking. On the 4th evening, the coastal fog had rolled in thick and heavy, making the marble floors slightly slick from the humidity. Georgia had just finished baking a loaf of her grandmother's honey wheat bread, its golden brown crust still warm from the oven. The recipe was one of her favorites, passed down through generations of her family, and the familiar scent of it filled the kitchen with memories of Sunday dinners and grace said over steaming plates. She carefully arranged thick slices on a silver serving plate, adding a small crock of freshly whipped butter beside them. The bread would accompany the roasted chicken she'd prepared, with herbs tucked under its crispy skin and vegetables roasted to caramelized perfection around it. "Just let me get this bread to the table," she murmured to herself, lifting the tray. "Then I can start on tomorrow's menu planning." The lighting in the hallway between the kitchen and dining room was dim, with shadows pooling in the corners. Georgia moved carefully, conscious of the precious cargo in her hands. She was almost to the dining room when it happened. Her foot hit a patch of moisture on the marble floor, and suddenly the world tilted sideways. The crash seemed deafening in the silence of the house. The silver tray hit the floor with a resounding clang, bread slices scattered across the marble like fallen leaves, and the butter crock cracked into pieces. "Oh no, oh no," Georgia whispered, dropping to her knees despite the protest of her joints. She began gathering the scattered bread, fighting back tears of frustration. This was exactly the kind of thing that could cost her this job, and she couldn't afford. A shadow fell across the floor beside her, and Georgia's breath caught in her throat. A tall figure had stepped out of the darkness of a nearby doorway, moving with the careful grace of someone used to going unnoticed. As he knelt beside her, Georgia got her first look at the mysterious Elliot Thorne. He was tall and lean, with the kind of face that might have graced magazine covers if not for the haunted look in his eyes. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw, and his expensive clothes hung slightly loose on his frame, as if he'd lost weight and hadn't bothered to replace them. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention. They were a striking shade of grey, like storm clouds gathering over the ocean, and filled with such profound sadness that it made her heart ache. Without speaking, he reached for a piece of bread at the same moment she did. Their fingers brushed, just the lightest touch of skin against skin, but his reaction was immediate and violent. He jerked back as if burned, his whole body going rigid with tension. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. "Don't," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I haven't been touched in 8 years." Georgia froze, her hand still suspended in midair. The pain in his voice was raw, exposed like an open wound. She could see him trembling. This powerful man reduced to vulnerability by the simplest human contact. In that moment, her heart moved with a compassion that overcame her fear of overstepping. "Then maybe," she said softly, her voice gentle as a summer breeze, "it's time someone did." Elliot Thorne stared at her, his storm cloud eyes wide with an emotion she couldn't name. For a moment, she thought he might speak. His lips parted slightly as if forming words. But then, like a shadow fleeing from sunlight, he turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. Georgia remained kneeling on the floor for several long moments, surrounded by scattered bread and broken crockery, her mind replaying the encounter. Eventually, she gathered herself and cleaned up the mess, her movements mechanical while her thoughts whirled. That night, lying in her bed in the staff quarters, sleep eluded her. The sound of distant waves crashing against the cliffs below the mansion provided a rhythmic backdrop to her thoughts. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about Elliot Thorne's words, 8 years without human touch. What kind of pain, she wondered, could make a person retreat so completely from human contact? What wounds lay beneath the surface of this man who lived like a ghost in his own home? The darkness offered no answers, but Georgia found herself whispering a prayer into the night. "Lord," she murmured, "whatever hurt him so badly, please help me understand. And if it's your will, maybe help me help him heal." The waves continued their endless rhythm against the shore, and somewhere in the massive house, she thought she heard the faint notes of a piano, playing a melody that sounded like grief given voice. The morning after their encounter in the hallway, Georgia found a cream-colored note card propped against the coffee maker. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural in its clean lines. "The beef stew was excellent, thank you." She smiled, tracing the words with her fingertip, noticing how the ink had pooled slightly at the end of each letter, as if the writer had hesitated before moving on. It became their way of talking. Each day brought new notes, like leaves scattered across the kitchen's pristine countertops. "The rosemary bread reminded me of a bakery in Paris," one read. Another simply asked, "How do you make the sauce so smooth?" Georgia began responding in kind, leaving her notes tucked under empty plates or folded beside the coffee machine. She wrote her recipes on index cards, adding little stories about where she'd learned them or what made them special. "My grandmother taught me this pie crust recipe," she wrote one day. "She always said love was the secret ingredient." The next morning, she found his reply. "Isabel used to say the same thing. She was my wife. She loved to bake." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife by name, and Georgia felt the weight of that trust. She responded carefully, writing on a pale blue napkin, "She sounds like she had a beautiful soul." As the days passed, their notes grew longer, more personal. Elliot shared memories of Isabel's favorite dishes, her love for fresh strawberries, how she would only eat chocolate cake on rainy days. Georgia found herself looking forward to his messages, each one revealing another piece of the man who lived like a shadow in this vast house. One Wednesday evening, as the setting sun painted the kitchen in shades of amber and gold, Georgia stood at the stove stirring a pot of homemade vegetable soup. Without thinking, she began to hum. An old hymn her grandmother had taught her. "Great is thy faithfulness." The melody filled the kitchen, mingling with the steam rising from the pot. She was halfway through the second verse when she felt it, that subtle shift in the air that meant she wasn't alone. She didn't turn around, but she could sense him there, lingering in the doorway like a moth drawn to lamplight. The hymn continued to flow from her lips, soft and sure. When she finally glanced over her shoulder, their eyes met. Elliot stood with one shoulder against the doorframe, his face half hidden in shadow. But his eyes, those storm cloud eyes, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You remind me of someone who used to sing," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Georgia's hands stilled on the wooden spoon. "Then I hope it brings you peace," she replied softly. He didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. Instead, he remained in the doorway, silent and still, until the last notes of the hymn faded into the evening air. Only then did he slip away, leaving nothing but the lingering sense of his presence. Georgia finished preparing dinner with trembling hands, her mind full of questions she didn't dare ask. Who had sung to him before? Was it Isabel? What happened to make this man retreat so completely from the world? That night, as she sat in her room reviewing recipes for the next day, she heard it. The sound of piano keys being struck, hesitant at first, then growing more confident. The melody drifted through the halls of the massive house, a song she didn't recognize, but one that seemed to speak of longing and loss, of memories too precious to speak aloud. She closed her eyes and listened, imagining Elliot at the piano, his long fingers moving across the keys, perhaps remembering another time when music filled these rooms. The piece spoke of something deep and painful, like a wound that had never properly healed. Each note seemed to carry a story, of love found and lost, of silence and solitude, of grief held so tightly it had become a shield against the world. Georgia sat perfectly still, letting the music wash over her, understanding that she was witnessing something profound, the first cracks in the walls Elliot had built around himself. As the final notes faded into silence, Georgia opened her eyes to find tears on her cheeks. She wiped them away gently, her heart full of compassion for this broken man who was, perhaps, beginning to remember how to feel. The next morning, she left a note alongside his breakfast. Music has a way of saying what our hearts can't find words for. When she returned later, she found his response written in that precise hand. Some words are too heavy to carry alone. And so their dance continued, a careful choreography of written words and shared silences, of music in the night and hymns in the kitchen. Two souls moving slowly, cautiously toward understanding, neither quite ready to acknowledge the fragile connection growing between them. Each day brought small changes. His notes grew longer, more personal. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of him in the house, no longer hiding completely in shadows. And every evening, as she prepared dinner, she would sing softly, knowing he was listening, hoping that somehow her simple songs might help heal whatever wounds had driven him into such profound isolation. The rhythm of their days became a gentle tide, his notes flowing out, her responses flowing back, punctuated by moments of quiet connection that grew more frequent with each passing day. In the vastness of the mansion, They had created something delicate and precious, a language of their own, spoken in handwritten words and melodies carried on the evening air. And through it all, Georgia prayed, not for any particular outcome, but simply for wisdom to understand and grace to help heal. She knew that somewhere beneath Elliot's carefully constructed walls lay a heart that remembered how to feel, how to connect, how to live fully in the world again. She just had to be patient enough to let him find his way back at his own pace. The mansion seemed to exhale, like a living thing waking from a long slumber. Georgia noticed it first in small ways. Curtains drawn back to let sunlight stream across polished floors, windows cracked open to let in the salt-tinged breeze. Fresh flowers began appearing in crystal vases throughout the house, their sweet perfume chasing away the sterile silence that had dominated the halls. Even Mrs. Brigham's stern demeanor softened around the edges. One morning, Georgia caught the housekeeper humming while arranging lilies in the foyer, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. When their eyes met, Mrs. Brigham didn't try to hide it. "It's good to hear music in these walls again," the housekeeper said softly, touching a velvet petal. "The house has been too quiet for too long." Georgia continued her daily rhythm of cooking and leaving notes, while Elliot's responses grew longer and more personal. Sometimes she'd find little sketches in the margins, a musical note, a flower, fragments of the life he'd locked away for so long. But their peaceful routine shattered one crisp morning when Mrs. Brigham burst into the kitchen, her face tight with worry. She thrust a tabloid magazine onto the counter, its glossy pages open to a grainy photograph. Georgia's heart sank as she saw herself, arms full of grocery bags, walking up the mansion's front steps. The headline screamed in bold letters, "Billionaire's plus-size chef. Is she feeding more than his appetite?" The article was cruel, filled with snide comments about her weight and speculation about her relationship with Elliot. They called her the lonely billionaire's comfort cook. And worse, questioning her qualifications and suggesting she was taking advantage of a grief-stricken man. "Mr. Thorne needs to be informed," Mrs. Brigham said, her voice strained. This could attract more unwanted attention. Before Georgia could respond, heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Elliot appeared in the doorway, his face thunderous, a tablet clutched in his white-knuckled grip. The kitchen staff scattered to the corners of the room, leaving only Georgia, Mrs. Brigham, and the angry billionaire. "This ends now," he declared, his voice shaking with rage. But when his eyes met Georgia's, they softened with concern. "I've already contacted my lawyers. They'll handle the legal response." Georgia felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thorne. I never meant to cause trouble." "No." Elliot's voice cracked like a whip, making everyone jump. He looked around at the staff members trying to blend into the walls. "Listen to me, all of you. This woman deserves respect. She has brought more life and kindness into this house than anyone has in years. I won't tolerate any gossip or disrespect toward her. Is that clear?" The staff murmured their agreement and filed out quickly, Mrs. Brigham herding them along with quiet efficiency. When the door swung shut, Georgia and Elliot were left alone in the suddenly silent kitchen. "I should go," Georgia whispered, wiping at her eyes. "The last thing you need is this kind of scandal." "Georgia." Elliot stepped closer, his presence filling her awareness. His hand trembled as he reached out, fingers brushing her cheek with butterfly gentleness. "You shouldn't be sorry for being kind." Before she could process what was happening, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, hesitant, trembling with emotion. His fingers cradled her face like she was something precious and fragile. Georgia's heart thundered in her chest as the world seemed to stop spinning for just a moment. When they finally pulled apart, Elliot rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I just needed to feel human again." Georgia stood frozen, her mind whirling with emotions she couldn't name. Elliot stepped back, vulnerability written across his features, then turned and walked quickly from the kitchen. Later that night, Georgia knelt beside her bed, hands clasped tightly as she prayed. "Lord, I don't know what to do," she whispered into the darkness. "My heart is pulling me one way, but I'm scared. What if this isn't your plan? What if I'm not strong enough to help him heal?" The ocean waves crashed outside her window, their rhythm steady and sure, but offering no answers. She touched her lips, still feeling the ghost of that kiss, torn between the warmth blooming in her heart and the cautioning voice of her faith. The mansion creaked and settled around her, its walls now holding one more secret, one more moment of connection between two lonely souls searching for their way forward. Georgia remained on her knees, praying for guidance, while the night deepened and stars wheeled overhead, each one holding its own quiet promise of hope. The morning sun painted long shadows across the mansion's marble floors, but the warmth couldn't chase away the chill of uncertainty that had settled over the house. Georgia's hands shook slightly as she measured coffee grounds, the familiar task doing little to calm her racing thoughts. Every footstep in the hallway made her heart jump. The kitchen staff moved around her like shadows, their whispered conversations dying whenever she came near. She caught fragments of their words, scandal and inappropriate, that made her cheeks burn with shame. The breakfast she prepared sat untouched on Elliot's usual table. She'd made his favorites, steel-cut oatmeal with fresh berries, whole-grain toast with local honey, and a perfectly poached egg. But the chair remained empty, its polished wood reflecting the morning light like an accusation. Mrs. Brigham appeared at 10 o'clock, her face a careful mask of professionalism. "Mr. Thorne sends his apologies," she said, her voice measured. "He's taking breakfast in his study today." Georgia nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "I understand. I'll start packing my things." "That won't be necessary." Mrs. Brigham's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Thorne specifically asked that you stay. He was quite insistent about it." The words brought both relief and a fresh wave of anxiety. Georgia busied herself with cleaning up breakfast, her mind replaying yesterday's kiss like a movie she couldn't stop watching. The gentle press of his lips, the trembling of his hands, the raw vulnerability in his voice when he'd pulled away. It all felt like a dream that couldn't possibly belong to her real life. The day stretched endlessly, filled with mundane tasks that couldn't distract her from the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. She prepared lunch, then dinner, going through the motions while her heart jumped at every sound. As evening settled over the mansion, Georgia found herself drawn to the conservatory. The glass-walled room had caught her eye during her first tour, but she'd never seen anyone use it. Now, through the weathered panels, she saw a familiar silhouette standing among the neglected plants. She hesitated at the doorway, watching Elliot's back as he stared out at the darkening ocean. Dead leaves crunched under her feet as she stepped inside, announcing her presence. He didn't turn around. The conservatory was a study in abandonment. Dried vines crawled up rusted trellises, and empty clay pots lined dusty shelves. What must have once been a vibrant garden had withered into a graveyard of brown stems and fallen leaves. "Isabel loved this room," Elliot said quietly, still facing the window. "She filled it with orchids and roses, said they needed daily attention to thrive." His voice caught, just like love. Georgia moved closer, careful not to disturb the heavy atmosphere. "Were you in love?" she asked softly. Elliot's laugh was hollow, empty of joy. I was her failure. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass. She needed someone who could see her heart, not just provide for her comfort. She painted, played piano, tried to fill this house with beauty. But I was too busy building my empire to notice she was drowning. The raw pain in his voice made Georgia's heart ache. She could picture Isabel here, tending her flowers, trying to grow beauty in a house that felt more like a museum. What happened? 8 years ago, I came home late from a business trip. Found her in the bathtub. His words fell like stones into still water. She'd left a note, said she couldn't bear the silence anymore. He turned finally, his face carved with shadows. I haven't let anyone close since then. Couldn't bear to fail someone else that way. Georgia moved without thinking, reaching for his arm. This time, he didn't flinch from her touch. Instead, he seemed to lean into it, like a plant starved for sunlight. I don't deserve kindness, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Georgia's heart swelled with compassion. This wasn't about romance or attraction. It was about healing, about the deep human need for connection. Then it's time you learn that grace isn't earned, she said softly, her fingers gentle on his sleeve. The sea breeze whistled through gaps in the conservatory's glass panels, stirring dead leaves around their feet. In the fading light, their shadows stretched long across the floor, touching and merging like watercolors. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words and shared understanding. She could feel his pulse racing under her fingers, could sense the battle between his desire to pull away and his desperate need for human contact. 8 years of self-imposed isolation had left deep scars, but here in this forgotten garden, something was beginning to crack open, like a seed finally breaking through its shell after a long winter. The dying light painted copper highlights in his disheveled hair, and Georgia noticed new lines around his eyes that hadn't been visible before, lines carved by grief and guilt rather than age. He looked simultaneously stronger and more fragile than the powerful billionaire she'd first met, as if showing his weakness had somehow made him more real. They stood together in the growing darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of dead flowers and the steady rhythm of waves against the shore. Neither spoke again, but the silence between them had changed, no longer a wall, but a bridge. The mansion seemed to exhale, like a body finally letting go of long-held tension. In the days following their conversation in the conservatory, Georgia felt a shift in the atmosphere. Subtle at first, like dawn breaking through clouds, then growing stronger with each passing day. She started small, tackling the dusty chapel wing that had sat unused for nearly a decade. Armed with cleaning supplies and determination, Georgia worked methodically through the space, throwing open heavy curtains and letting sunlight stream through stained glass windows. The colored light danced across the wooden pews as she hummed old hymns, her voice echoing off the walls. I haven't seen anyone in here since... Mrs. Brigham's voice startled Georgia as she polished the small altar. The housekeeper stood in the doorway, her usual stern expression softened by memory. Would you like to help? Georgia asked gently, holding out a dust cloth. To her surprise, Mrs. Brigham rolled up her sleeves and joined her. As they worked side by side, the older woman shared stories about Christmas services and Easter celebrations that used to fill this space with joy. For the first time, Georgia saw beyond the housekeeper's rigid exterior to the heart that had been quietly grieving the loss of life in this house. Inspired by this breakthrough, Georgia turned her attention to the kitchen staff next. She noticed how they ate their meals quickly and alone, scattering to different corners of the vast house. It didn't sit right with her spirit. Food was meant to bring people together, not drive them apart. We're going to have family-style dinners. she announced one morning, her tone brooking no argument. "Everyone together, once a week to start." When the staff exchanged uncertain glances, she added softly, "Including Mr. Thorne." The first staff dinner was awkward, with conversation barely rising above whispered requests to pass the salt. But George's warmth and genuine interest in everyone's lives gradually melted the ice. By the third week, laughter echoed off the dining room's high ceiling as the gardener shared funny stories about local wildlife stealing his plants. Elliot sat quietly at first, watching the easy camaraderie develop around him, with something like wonder in his eyes. Georgia noticed how he seemed to absorb every moment, like a man who'd forgotten what simple happiness looked like. The kitchen became the heart of the house, pumping life through its corridors. Georgia's gospel playlist provided a constant soundtrack as she cooked, her voice joining in with songs of praise and joy. More than once, she caught Elliot lingering in the doorway, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Your music choices are interesting," he teased one afternoon, raising an eyebrow at the upbeat chorus filling the kitchen. Georgia waved a wooden spoon at him playfully. "Don't pretend you haven't been tapping your foot to 'Oh Happy Day.' I saw you." His laugh, genuine and unguarded, surprised them both. It transformed his face, erasing years of sadness for a brief moment. Georgia's heart did a little flip at the sound. Their friendship grew in these quiet moments, built on shared smiles and comfortable silences. She learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders, while he seemed to sense when she needed space to pray or think. They circled each other carefully, both aware of the deeper currents pulling them together, but neither quite ready to name them. The changes in Elliot were subtle but significant. He started joining morning staff meetings, actually listening to concerns about household operations. His emails to the office became less frequent as he spent more time engaging with the people around him. The haunted look in his eyes began to fade, replaced by something warmer, more present. One evening, as Georgia finished cleaning up after dinner, Elliot appeared in the kitchen clutching an old leather-bound book. His fingers traced its worn spine almost reverently. "I found this while cleaning out some boxes," he said, placing it on the counter. "It was Isabel's grandmother's cookbook." Georgia wiped her hands on her apron and approached carefully, sensing the weight of this moment. The book's pages were yellowed, many marked with handwritten notes in different styles of penmanship, generations of women adding their wisdom to family recipes. "I'd forgotten what home feels like until you walked in," Elliot said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "This house, it was just a place to hide, but you've made it feel alive again." Georgia's throat tightened with emotion. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked softly. "We could look through it together." He nodded, and they settled at the kitchen island while the coffee brewed. As rain began pattering against the windows, they pored over the cookbook's pages, sharing stories sparked by different recipes. "My mother made the worst biscuits," Elliot chuckled, pointing to a recipe. "Hard as rocks. We used to joke about using them as paperweights." Georgia smiled, remembering her own childhood. "My mama was the opposite. Everything she touched turned to gold in the kitchen. But she was so protective of her recipes, she'd shoo everyone out when she cooked. I learned by sneaking peeks around the doorframe." The hours slipped by unnoticed as they traded memories, their coffee growing cold in forgotten cups. The gentle rain outside created a cozy cocoon around them, making the vast kitchen feel intimate and warm. By midnight, Georgia knew more about young Elliot's adventures and mishaps than she'd learned in all her previous weeks at the mansion. She saw him now not as the reclusive billionaire or the grieving widower, but as a man who'd lost his way and was slowly finding his path back to joy. His smile came easier, his laughter more frequent, and when their eyes met across the kitchen island, she felt something shift and settle in her heart, a recognition of possibility, of hope. The rain continued its soft percussion against the windows, nature's gentle reminder that even the longest drought can end, that new life can spring from barren ground. In this quiet midnight hour, surrounded by the warmth of shared stories and the scent of coffee, Georgia felt the mansion's transformation mirroring their own, from a place of shadows to one of light, from silence to song, from loneliness to connection. The morning sun cast long shadows through the study windows as Georgia dusted the endless rows of leather-bound books. The room smelled of old paper and polish, a scent that reminded her of libraries and quiet afternoons. She hummed softly while working, careful not to disturb the organized chaos of Elliot's private sanctuary. As she lifted a heavy volume of financial records, a yellowed newspaper clipping fluttered to the floor. Georgia bent to retrieve it, and her breath caught as she read the bold headline, "Tech mogul's wife found dead. Questions surround Isabel Thorne's tragic end." Her hands trembled as she scanned the article. The words seemed to leap off the page. Sources close to the family suggest marital troubles. Mrs. Thorne's history of depression. Mr. Thorne's notorious workaholism and emotional unavailability. Questions remain about the circumstances. Georgia's heart ached as she studied the accompanying photograph. Isabel Thorne had been beautiful, with delicate features and sad eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. She wore a flowing dress and sat at the grand piano, the same one that now stood silent in the east wing. "Lord, give me wisdom," Georgia whispered, carefully folding the clipping. She couldn't unread those words, but neither could she judge. Everyone had their burdens, their crosses to bear. Still, the article's implications weighed heavy on her heart as she continued her cleaning, each dust mote in the sunlight, seeming to carry the weight of untold stories. Throughout the day, Georgia went about her usual tasks, but her mind kept returning to the article. She saw Elliot differently now, understanding better the shadows that haunted his eyes, the way he flinched from human contact. It wasn't just grief she saw in him. It was guilt. Evening settled over the mansion like a heavy blanket. Georgia had just finished preparing a light supper when the first notes of piano music drifted through the halls. The melody was hauntingly familiar, the same one she'd heard before, but tonight it carried an extra measure of sorrow. Following the sound, Georgia made her way to the east wing. The door to the music room stood slightly ajar, spilling warm lamplight into the darkened hallway. She paused at the threshold, not wanting to intrude, but drawn by both the music and the soft sounds of distress coming from within. Elliot sat at the piano, his shoulders curved inward as if protecting himself from invisible blows. In the soft light, she could see tears tracking down his face as his fingers moved across the keys. The melody spoke of loneliness and regret, of words left unsaid and chances never taken. Without thinking, Georgia began to sing softly. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." The piano music faltered, then stopped. Elliot's hands fell away from the keys, but he didn't turn around. "You shouldn't have to see this side of me," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Georgia took a step into the room, then another. "Maybe it's the side that needs the most love." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Elliot's shoulders began to shake, and Georgia moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his back. This time, he didn't pull away. "I killed her," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. "Not with my hands, but with my neglect, with my silence, with my absence." Georgia pulled up a chair beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to overwhelm. "Tell me," she said simply. And he did. The words poured out of him like a dam breaking, years of pent-up guilt and grief finding release. He told her about meeting Isabel in college, about her artist soul and gentle heart, how she'd filled their early years with music and color and life, how the company had grown, demanding more and more of his time and attention. She started slipping away so gradually, he said, staring at his hands on the keys. The signs were there. She stopped painting, stopped playing music. She'd sit for hours just staring at nothing. But I was too busy building an empire to notice my kingdom was crumbling at home. Georgia listened, her heart breaking for both of them, for Isabel's desperate loneliness and for Elliot's crushing guilt. The day it happened, he continued, his voice cracking. She left me a note. Just 3 words. I needed you. And she was right. She needed me and I wasn't there. I was in Singapore, closing a deal that seemed so important at the time. Now I can't even remember what it was for. Tears fell freely down his face now. How do you live with yourself when you know you failed the person who needed you most? Georgia took his hand in hers, feeling the slight tremor in his fingers. You can't heal by hiding, she said softly. Guilt is a prison, Elliot, and you've been locking yourself inside it for 8 years. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. How do you do that? He asked. How do you see right through to the heart of things? She smiled gently. Because I've learned that God doesn't waste our pain. Sometimes our deepest wounds become the very places where His light shines through. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of confession hanging between them like a shared breath. Then Georgia began to sing again, soft and low. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. This time, Elliot's hands found the keys, accompanying her. The melody rose and fell, filling the room with something that felt like hope. As they made music together, Georgia could almost imagine Isabel smiling down on them, grateful that her husband was finally learning to open his heart again. When the last note faded away, Elliot spoke again, his voice stronger now. Thank you, he said simply, for not running away when you saw the mess inside me. Georgia squeezed his hand. Sometimes the biggest act of faith is just sitting with someone in their pain. That night marked a turning point in their relationship. The walls that had kept Elliot isolated for so long began to crumble, brick by brick, under the gentle persistence of Georgia's compassion. Their connection deepened, rooted now in something more profound than attraction or comfort, a shared understanding of brokenness and the possibility of healing. As Georgia walked back to her room later that night, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She wasn't just cooking meals anymore. She was watching a man's soul come back to life. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, and she sent up a silent prayer for wisdom to handle this fragile trust with the care it deserved. Georgia stood in the doorway of the guest house, her mind already transforming the dusty space into something vibrant and alive. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating dancing dust motes and highlighting the room's potential. She could see it all so clearly, tables where lonely hearts could gather, a bustling kitchen where healing could begin, one meal at a time. What do you think? She asked, turning to Elliot, who stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. He surveyed the space thoughtfully. It needs work, he said, running a hand along a counter thick with dust. But I trust your vision. Tell me more about what you're thinking. Georgia's eyes lit up as she walked into the center of the room. Well, we could put industrial stoves here, she gestured, and prep tables along this wall. Maybe some round tables by the windows where people can sit and talk while they eat. She paused, suddenly self-conscious. I know it's a big ask. It's perfect. Elliot interrupted, a small smile playing at his lips. This place has been empty for too long. Like me, I suppose. Over the next few weeks, the guest house transformation became their shared mission. Georgia coordinated with local contractors, while Elliot handled permits and equipment orders. They spent hours together picking out appliances, their shoulders brushing as they looked through catalogues. This one, Georgia would say, pointing to a commercial range. Done, Elliot would reply, never questioning the cost. What else do we need? The local volunteer response overwhelmed them both. Church groups, veterans organizations, and community members stepped forward to help with painting, cleaning, and organizing. Georgia watched in amazement as Elliot rolled up his sleeves alongside them, hauling boxes and moving furniture. Mr. Thorne, she called out one afternoon, trying not to laugh. You've got paint in your hair. He ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, making it worse. Well, Ms. Holloway, some of us actually work for a living. He teased, referencing a famous cornbread that had become a daily request from the volunteers. Oh, is that right? She shot back, grinning. Then I suppose you won't be wanting any of today's batch? Now let's not be hasty, he said, his eyes twinkling. I'm willing to negotiate. The warmth between them grew naturally, like sunshine spreading across morning frost. Georgia noticed how Elliot seemed younger somehow, more relaxed. His laugh came easier, and his eyes held light instead of shadows. On opening day, the guest house gleamed. Fresh paint brightened the walls, new curtains framed the windows, and the kitchen equipment sparkled. Local news vans parked outside, their reporters setting up cameras to capture the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Georgia stood back, watching as people filled the space. Veterans in wheelchairs rolled up to tables designed just for them. Elderly widows gathered in corners, already sharing recipes and stories. Young mothers with tired eyes found comfortable chairs and hot coffee. You did this, Elliot said quietly, appearing beside her. You saw what this place could be. We did this, she corrected him, smoothing her apron nervously as reporters approached. The cameras rolled as Elliot stepped up to give his speech. Georgia held her breath, remembering how much he used to avoid public appearances. But he stood straight and tall, his voice clear and strong. 8 months ago, this mansion was as empty as I was, he began. Then Georgia Holloway walked through my door with a pot of stew and more wisdom than any business school could teach. She showed me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch. He paused, his eyes finding hers in the crowd. She taught me that the greatest wealth is compassion. The applause was thunderous, but Georgia barely heard it over the pounding of her heart. She watched as Elliot handled interviews with grace, deflecting personal questions and keeping the focus on the community kitchen's mission. As evening approached, the crowds thinned out. The last reporter packed up their equipment, and the volunteers headed home, leaving behind a comfortable silence. Georgia supervised the final cleanup, while Elliot made a few calls in his office. I have a surprise for you, he said when he returned, leading her toward the patio. The sight took her breath away. Dozens of lanterns hung from strings stretched between posts, their warm light creating a magical glow. A small table had been set for two, with fine china and crystal glasses catching the light. When did you do all this? She asked, touching one of the lanterns gently. I may have had some help, he admitted, pulling out her chair. Mrs. Brigham is quite the conspirator when she wants to be. They shared a meal of all their favorites, her cornbread, his mother's pasta recipe, fresh vegetables from the garden they'd started behind the kitchen. The ocean provided a gentle soundtrack, waves whispering against the shore below. "I've been thinking," Elliot said as they finished their dessert, "about how much has changed since you arrived." Georgia nodded, remembering the cold, empty mansion she'd first encountered. "Everything feels more alive now." "Yes," he agreed softly, "including me." In the lantern light, his face looked open and vulnerable, reminding her of that night at the piano when he'd first shared his pain. But now there was something else there too. Hope, perhaps, or possibility. Slowly, deliberately, he reached across the table for her hand. Georgia looked at his outstretched fingers, remembering how he once flinched at the slightest touch. Now he was offering connection freely, choosing to reach out instead of pull away. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers. Neither spoke for a long moment, letting the simple contact say what words couldn't yet express. The lanterns swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting dancing shadows across their joined hands. In that moment, under a sky full of stars and surrounded by the gentle glow of lanterns, Georgia felt something shift and settle in her heart. This wasn't just about helping someone heal anymore. This was about two people discovering that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead exactly where you're meant to be. Their fingers remained intertwined as they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the waves and watching the lantern light flicker against the gathering dark. The piece lasted exactly 3 days after the community kitchen's opening. Georgia was preparing breakfast when Mrs. Brigham hurried into the kitchen, her usually composed face twisted with concern. "Dear, you need to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. Georgia wiped her hands on her apron and took the device. The screen showed a national morning news program, and her heart stopped when she saw her mother's face. Sarah Holloway sat primly in a studio chair, her silver hair perfectly styled, wearing the same disapproving expression Georgia remembered from childhood. "My daughter has always used food to manipulate people," Sarah was saying, her voice crisp and cold. "She thinks if she feeds them enough, they'll overlook her shortcomings. Now she's found herself a lonely billionaire to pity her. It's embarrassing, really." The reporter leaned forward. "So, you're saying Georgia Holloway is using Elliot Thorne? She's buying love with pity, just like she's always done." Sarah's lips curved in a familiar smirk. "Though I must say, she's aimed higher than usual this time." Georgia's hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the tablet. Mrs. Brigham quickly took it from her, pulling her into a fierce hug. "That woman doesn't deserve to call herself your mother," she muttered, but the damage was done. Within hours, the interview went viral. Social media exploded with cruel memes and nastier comments. Local news vans appeared outside the mansion gates, reporters shouting questions whenever anyone entered or left. By afternoon, the first protesters arrived. They carried signs with horrible messages about Georgia's weight, her faith, her race. Some suggested she was a gold digger, others claimed she was ruining Elliot's reputation. Their voices carried across the mansion grounds, each word a fresh wound. Georgia tried to keep working, to focus on preparing dinner, but her mother's words kept echoing in her head. Had she been fooling herself? Was she really just using pity to make people love her? Elliot found her in the kitchen, staring blankly at an unpeeled potato. Without a word, he wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I've already called security," he said softly. "They'll clear those idiots away." Georgia squeezed his hand but pulled away. "You shouldn't have to deal with this. Your company's stock price dropped 5 points today because of me. I don't care about the stock price. But you should." She turned to face him, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "You've worked too hard to build everything you have. I won't be the reason it all falls apart." "Georgia." His voice cracked slightly. You're the reason it all started making sense again." She touched his cheek gently, memorizing the feel of his skin under her fingers. "You've got your reputation to protect. The board members are already calling, aren't they?" His silence was answer enough. "I saw the headlines," she continued. "Billionaire's charity case. Tech mogul's plus-size problem. They're turning us into some kind of circus. We can weather this." He insisted. "I'll hire the best PR team. We'll give interviews, show them the real story." "And what is our real story, Elliot?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. He reached for her, but she stepped back. "I need some air," she whispered, hurrying from the kitchen. Georgia spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of her routine while her heart crumbled piece by piece. She served dinner, cleaned up, and retreated to her room early, claiming a headache. At midnight, when the mansion was silent, she began to pack. Her hands moved mechanically, folding clothes into her old suitcase. She left behind anything Elliot had given her: the chef's knives, the new aprons, the cookbook he'd found at an auction. In the kitchen, she wrote her note with trembling fingers. "Thank you for letting me bring life back into your home, but I can't let you be destroyed because of me." She hesitated, pen hovering over the paper, so many words crowding her throat. In the end, she simply signed her name. The drive away from the mansion felt surreal. Protesters still camped outside the gates caught her headlights, but in the dark, they didn't recognize her modest sedan. Their signs cast strange shadows in the night. Tears blurred her vision as she turned onto the coastal highway. The same road that had brought her to hope now carried her away from it. The ocean roared somewhere in the darkness, its sound mixing with her quiet sobs. She drove without destination, her mother's words chasing her into the night. Buying love with pity. Maybe she had been. Maybe that's all she'd ever done, trying to feed people enough love that they'd forget she wasn't worthy of it herself. The night grew deeper around her as she left behind the mansion, the community kitchen, and the man who had somehow slipped past all her careful defenses. She drove until the tears made it impossible to see, then pulled over at a rest stop, put her head on the steering wheel, and let grief wash over her in waves. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "I thought this was your plan. I thought, finally." But she couldn't finish the prayer. The only sound was the distant surf and her own broken breathing as the night wrapped around her like a shroud. Morning crept into the mansion like a grey mist. The usual warmth that had filled these halls over the past weeks had vanished, leaving behind only echoes of what was lost. Mrs. Brigham discovered the note first, her hands trembling as she read George's farewell. Without a word, she carried it to Elliot's study. He sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen without seeing it, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. When Mrs. Brigham placed the note before him, his face drained of what little colour it had. "Sir," she said softly, "Miss Holloway is gone." Elliot's fingers traced the words on the paper, reading them once, twice, then again and again. His thumb smudged the ink where a tear had fallen on the word home. The paper crinkled in his grip as his shoulders hunched forward. "When?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometime in the night, sir. Her room is empty. Mrs. Brigham hesitated. "She left behind all the gifts you gave her." Elliot nodded slowly, still staring at the note. "Thank you, Mrs. Brigham. That will be all." The housekeeper lingered for a moment, concern etched on her face. "Should I arrange for a new chef, sir?" "No." The word came out sharp, final. "No one else." As Mrs. Brigham quietly closed the door, Elliot leaned back in his chair, George's note clutched in his hand. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something that wouldn't come. No hymns drifted up from the kitchen. No warm aromas filled the air. No gentle laughter echoed through the halls. Days passed in a fog of silence. The staff moved like ghosts through their duties, speaking in whispers as if afraid to disturb the heavy quiet. Elliot tried to work, opening emails and staring at spreadsheets, but the words blurred together meaninglessly. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from board members and PR teams, all demanding responses about the situation. He ignored them all. In his office, he pulled up news articles about Georgia, reading every cruel comment, every mockery of her appearance, every speculation about their relationship. His jaw clenched tighter with each word. These strangers who had never known her kindness, never seen her light up a room with her smile, never felt the genuine warmth of her presence, they had driven her away with their hatred. On the third day, the community kitchen called. Elliot stared at the phone for 4 rings before answering. "Mr. Thorne?" The volunteer coordinator's voice was hesitant. "We were wondering if Miss Holloway would be available to help with the menu planning for next week's Veterans Dinner." Elliot's throat tightened. "She's no longer with us." "Oh." The disappointment was palpable. "Will she be back soon? The veterans keep asking about her cornbread, and Mrs. Jenkins says no one makes chicken soup quite like Georgia does." "I'm sorry," Elliot managed. I don't know if... He couldn't finish the sentence. After hanging up, he sat in silence, remembering how Georgia's face would light up when talking about the community kitchen, how she'd spend hours planning menus to accommodate everyone's needs, how she treated each person who came through those doors with dignity and care. That evening, he found himself wandering through the mansion's kitchen. It was spotless, everything in its place. But it felt wrong. Empty. Dead. His fingers trailed along the counter where he'd watched her knead bread countless times, humming hymns under her breath. The rolling pin she'd used sat in its holder, still dusted with flour. Her favorite apron, the one with tiny embroidered flowers along the pocket, hung by the door as if waiting for her return. Elliot picked up the apron, the fabric soft from use. He could almost smell the vanilla and cinnamon that seemed to follow Georgia everywhere. His vision blurred as he held it close. "You were the miracle," he whispered into the quiet kitchen. Not the mess. The truth of those words hit him hard. Georgia had never been the problem. She'd been the solution he didn't know he needed. She'd brought life back to his home, hope back to his heart, and for the first time in 8 years, she'd made him want to be better than he was. Standing there in the kitchen where she'd worked her quiet magic, Elliot felt something break inside him. The walls he'd built after Isabel's death, the careful distance he'd maintained, from everyone and everything, the fear that had ruled his life, it all came crashing down. Without thinking about it, without planning it, he found himself kneeling on the kitchen floor. 8 years of avoiding prayer, of turning away from faith, of believing he didn't deserve grace. And now here he was, on his knees, Georgia's apron clutched in his hands. "God," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I know I haven't. It's been a long time." He swallowed hard. "I don't deserve to ask for anything. I've spent years building wealth, building walls, building everything except what matters. But I'm not asking for more money or success or power." Tears fell freely now, spotting the kitchen floor. "I'm asking for courage. Courage to love again. Courage to be the kind of man who deserves someone like Georgia. Courage to face my past and my pain and stop running." His voice broke on the next words. "Please, help me find the strength to fight for what matters. Help me find her. Help me make this right." The prayer ended, but Elliot remained kneeling, letting years of suppressed grief and longing wash over him. The kitchen stayed quiet around him. But somehow the silence felt different now. Not empty, but waiting. Not dead, but dormant. Like the earth before spring, holding the promise of renewal beneath the surface. Finally he stood, carefully hanging George's apron back on its hook. His legs felt shaky, his heart raw and exposed, but for the first time in years, he felt something else too. Hope. Small and fragile as a seedling, but alive. The mansion might feel dead now, the piano might be silent, and the halls might echo with absence. But Elliot knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't let this end here. Not when Georgia had taught him how to live again. Not when she'd shown him what real strength looked like. Not when she'd helped him remember how to feel. He touched the rolling pin one last time, remembering how Georgia's hands had moved with such confidence as she worked. She'd known exactly how to bring things to life. Bread, hope, hearts. Now it was his turn to learn from her example, to stop hiding, to start healing, to fight for what mattered. Night settled over the mansion, but Elliot remained in the kitchen, surrounded by memories of the woman who had changed everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new chances to prove he could be better than his past. But for now, he let himself feel the full weight of loss and love, knowing that sometimes the deepest prayers are the ones we pray on our knees in empty kitchens, holding nothing but hope and an apron full of memories. 6 days, 6 endless days since Georgia had left, and each one stretched longer than the last. The mansion's halls echoed with a silence that felt heavier than before she'd arrived, because now Elliot knew what he was missing. On the 7th morning, he sat in his study, absently scrolling through news feeds when he found himself watching that cruel interview again. Georgia's mother, a sharp-featured woman with judging eyes, sat primly on a floral couch, speaking words that dripped with poison. But this time, instead of feeling anger, Elliot focused on the location tag beneath her name. Speaking from Millbrook, Tennessee. His hands trembled as he grabbed his car keys. The sky outside matched his mood, dark clouds gathering, promising rain. He didn't bother packing a bag or telling the staff where he was going. He just needed to drive, to move, to do something to break this paralyzing emptiness. The first drops hit his windshield as he pulled out of the gates. By the time he reached the highway, the rain was falling in sheets, but he kept going. The wipers beat a steady rhythm as memories of Georgia flooded his mind. He remembered her standing in his kitchen that first night, the way she'd whispered grace over food she wasn't even going to eat. He saw her kneeling to help him pick up broken pieces of bread and china, unafraid to touch his trembling hands. He heard her humming hymns while she worked, her voice carrying peace into every corner of his home. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the road ahead. 3 hours into his journey, the rain still hadn't let up. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he remembered their first real conversation in the conservatory, how she'd looked at him with such compassion when he'd confessed his failure with Isabel. "I don't deserve kindness," he'd told her. "Then it's time you learn that grace isn't earned." She'd replied. Now, driving through the storm, those words hit him with new force. Grace isn't earned. It never had been. All these years he'd been punishing himself, believing he had to atone for Isabel's death through isolation and self-hatred. But Georgia had shown him something different. She hadn't tried to save him. That's what he realized as mile markers flew past in the rain. She'd simply reminded him of God's mercy, through her cooking, her kindness, her quiet faith that infused everything she did. She'd brought life back into his home, not by forcing change, but by living out her beliefs with gentle authenticity. The storm intensified as night fell. Most drivers had pulled over, but Elliot pressed on. Every mile brought fresh memories. Georgia organizing family dinners for the staff, her face lighting up when she talked about the community kitchen, The way she'd touched his arm that night, he broke down at the piano. Near midnight, he crossed the Tennessee state line. His GPS told him Millbrook was just 30 minutes away. His heart pounded harder with each passing mile. What would he say to her? How could he explain that she'd awakened not just his heart, but his soul? The rain was still falling when he entered the small town. Street lights reflected off wet pavement, and the buildings looked sleepy and shuttered. He drove slowly, searching, until he spotted a familiar car parked outside a modest white church. George's aging sedan sat there, water streaming down its windows. Elliot pulled into the parking lot, killing the engine. Through the rain, he could hear music drifting from the church. Rich, soulful gospel harmonies rising above the storm. The sign out front read, New Hope Baptist Church, Sunday service 8:30 a.m. He glanced at his watch. 8:25. His clothes were rumpled from the long drive, and he hadn't shaved in days. But none of that mattered now. He stepped out into the rain, letting it soak through his expensive shirt and pants. The cold drops felt like a baptism, washing away his hesitation. Standing before the church doors, Elliot paused. The last time he'd entered a house of worship was for Isabel's funeral. 8 years of avoiding God, avoiding faith, avoiding vulnerability. And now here he was, dripping wet on a church doorstep in Tennessee. The music swelled inside, voices lifted in praise, piano and organ weaving together in joyful celebration. He recognized the melody. Amazing Grace. The same hymn Georgia had sung that night in his study, when she'd found him crying at the piano. His hand shook as he reached for the door handle. What right did he have to walk into this sacred space? What right did he have to disturb Georgia's peace again? But then he remembered her words. Grace isn't earned. Taking a deep breath, Elliot pulled open the door. The music washed over him in a wave of harmony and hope. Warm light spilled out into the rainy morning, beckoning him inside. With water dripping from his clothes and his heart pounding in his chest, he stepped across the threshold. The congregation was standing, their voices raised in song. Many heads turned to look at the soaking wet stranger in their midst, but Elliot barely noticed. His eyes searched the rows of people until he found her. Georgia, standing near the front, her own voice lifted in praise. She hadn't seen him yet. For a moment he just watched her sing, her face glowing with an inner light that had nothing to do with the sunshine streaming through stained glass. She looked at home here, at peace, surrounded by faith and music and grace. Elliot stood in the back of the church, rainwater pooling at his feet, as the voices around him sang about amazing grace that saved a wretch like him. And for the first time in 8 years, he felt not like a man trying to earn redemption, but like a soul coming home. The final notes of the hymn faded away, and in that moment of quiet, Georgia turned. Their eyes met across the crowded church, and everything else seemed to fade away. The rain outside, the whispers of the congregation, the weight of the past. All that remained was this moment, this chance, this grace. The church fell silent as Elliot took his first steps down the center aisle. Water dripped from his expensive clothes onto the worn carpet, each footstep echoing in the hushed sanctuary. Some people whispered and pointed. They'd seen his face in newspapers and on television. Others simply stared, sensing they were witnessing something profound. Georgia stood frozen beside the choir stand, her hand gripping the wooden railing. Her heart thundered so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. Elliot's face was different than she remembered. Unshaven, vulnerable, his eyes red from either tears or lack of sleep. Or maybe both. In the front pew, Georgia's mother, Vivian Holloway, sat ramrod straight, her Sunday hat tilted at a perfect angle. Her mouth fell open as she recognized the billionaire from the news stories, the man her daughter had worked for, the one at the center of all the scandal. But this didn't look like the polished tech mogul from television. This was a man broken open by love. The congregation collectively held its breath as Elliot reached the front of the church. Without hesitation, he dropped to his knees before Georgia, water pooling around him on the carpet. His voice, when it came, was rough with emotion and carried to every corner of the sanctuary. "You taught me that love isn't about who deserves it," he said, his words breaking on the last syllable. "It's about who still believes it's possible." A soft gasp rippled through the church. Someone in the back sniffled. The morning sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows painted colors across Elliot's face. Red, blue, gold, like God's own spotlight on this moment of surrender. Georgia's hands trembled as she looked down at this man, this brilliant, wounded soul who'd driven through the night to find her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. Behind her, the choir members exchanged glances, moved by the raw emotion before them. Elliot reached for her hand, his own shaking visibly. When his fingers closed around hers, the touch was gentle, reverent. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it softly, his next words barely above a whisper, but carrying through the silent church like a prayer. "You once fed me grace when I'd forgotten the taste." Vivian Holloway pressed a hand to her mouth, tears filling her eyes as she watched her daughter, the daughter she'd criticized and belittled for so many years, being treasured so completely by this man. Georgia felt her heart expand with so much love it almost hurt. This wasn't just about romance, it was about redemption, about two broken people finding wholeness in God's perfect timing. She stepped forward, still crying, and reached down to help Elliot to his feet. "Then come sit beside me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll eat grace together this time." Several people in the congregation were openly weeping now. The pastor stood at his pulpit, his own eyes glistening as he watched this unexpected sermon unfold, a living testament to God's transformative love. Elliot rose slowly, his hand still holding Georgia's, water still dripping from his clothes. But his eyes never left her face, as if she were the only fixed point in his universe. The morning light caught the tears on his cheeks, making them shine like diamonds. Together they moved to an empty pew. Georgia's mother shifted over to make room, her expression softened by what she'd witnessed. The pastor cleared his throat, clearly moved, and began to speak about how God's love often comes to us in unexpected ways, through unexpected people. As the service resumed, Elliot and Georgia sat close together, their shoulders touching, their hands still intertwined. She could feel him trembling slightly, whether from the cold of his wet clothes or the magnitude of the moment, she wasn't sure. But when she squeezed his hand, he squeezed back, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where they both needed to be. The church's old heating system hummed softly, and the rain continued to fall outside. But inside, something profound had shifted. The congregation began to sing again, their voices rising in harmony, lifting prayers of thanksgiving for this visible miracle of love and grace. Elliot leaned closer to Georgia and whispered, "I didn't just come back for you. I came back for the person I become when I'm with you. Someone who believes in mercy again." Georgia turned to look at him, seeing past the billionaire facade to the man beneath, the one who'd driven through the night, walked into a strange church soaking wet, and knelt before her in front of everyone. The one who was learning, just as she had, that love doesn't require perfection, only presence. "Welcome home," she whispered back, and felt him relax beside her as the choir began to sing about amazing grace, about being lost and then found, about being blind but now seeing. The coastal mansion had transformed over the past few months. Where silence once ruled, joy now echoed through its halls. Sunlight streamed through windows that were no longer shuttered, and the gardens bloomed with fresh life. The community kitchen in the guest house buzzed with activity 6 days a week, serving hot meals and warm smiles to those in need. Georgia's influence touched every corner of the estate. The chapel wing, once gathering dust, now hosted weekly faith gatherings where people from all walks of life came together to pray and share their stories. Every Sunday afternoon, the sound of hymns and heartfelt prayers drifted through the open windows as Georgia led her prayer circle in the newly renovated sunroom. The kitchen staff had doubled to handle both the mansion's needs and the community outreach programs. Mrs. Brigham, who once moved through the house like a shadow, now smiled openly and helped coordinate volunteers. The dining room regularly hosted family-style meals where staff, volunteers, and visitors broke bread together. In the East Wing, Elliot had set up a technology training center where he mentored veterans, teaching them entrepreneurship skills and helping them build their own businesses. The sound of keyboards clicking and enthusiastic discussions about startup ideas replaced the hollow echo of empty rooms. His eyes lit up when explaining complex concepts to his students, and he'd found a new purpose in sharing his knowledge. On this particular evening, as the sun began its descent over the ocean, Georgia and Elliot stood together on the master suite's balcony. The sea breeze carried the salt-sweet scent of the water, and seagulls called out their evening songs. Georgia wore a flowing sundress that caught the wind, while Elliot had loosened his tie after a day of mentoring. "You know what I realized today?" Elliot said, his voice soft with wonder. 8 years of silence, and then you came singing." He shook his head, still amazed at how much had changed. "I used to think the quiet was protecting me, but it was just hiding me from life." Georgia turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. "That's what love does when it's real," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "It sings louder than pain." She reached up and straightened his collar, a simple gesture that would have made him flinch just months ago. "Love doesn't erase the hurt, but it gives us a new song to sing." Elliot's arms slipped around her waist, drawing her close. There was no hesitation now, no fear in his touch. The trembling that once accompanied every physical contact had melted away, replaced by the natural comfort of two souls who'd found their way home to each other. They stood there quietly, watching the waves dance below. From the guest house, they could hear laughter as the evening's cooking class wrapped up. The community kitchen had become known for teaching nutrition and cooking skills alongside serving meals, empowering people to care for themselves and others. "Sometimes I wonder," Elliot murmured against her hair, "if Isabel can see us now, if she knows that her death wasn't the end of the story." His voice held no guilt now, just gentle remembrance. Georgia leaned back against his chest, feeling his steady heartbeat. "I believe she does, and I believe she's smiling, seeing you choose life again." The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, a daily reminder of God's artistry. Below them, the first participants for the evening prayer meeting began arriving, their voices carrying up on the breeze. Some were regulars from the Veterans Program, others from the community kitchen, and still others from the local church, all drawn together by the spirit of healing that now permeated the mansion. Elliot's embrace tightened slightly, and Georgia felt him release a contented sigh. The man who once couldn't bear to be touched now found his greatest peace in holding her close. It wasn't just their love story. It was a testament to God's ability to restore what seemed irreparably broken. "We should head down," Georgia said softly. "The prayer circle will be starting soon." But Elliot, held her for one moment more, savoring the peace of this quiet interlude. "Thank you," he whispered, "for teaching me that grace isn't just something we receive. It's something we can give too." Georgia turned in his arms and placed her hand on his cheek, smiling at how naturally he leaned into her touch now. The setting sun cast a warm glow across their faces as they stood together, two hearts that had found healing in the most unexpected ways. The evening breeze carried the first notes of a hymn from below, and they knew it was time to join the others. But for this moment they remained still, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the sun paint the sea in colors of promise. 1 year had passed since the community kitchen opened its doors, and the mansion hummed with an energy that made the very foundations sing. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling lawn, where dozens of tables had been set up for the anniversary celebration. White tablecloths fluttered in the gentle ocean breeze, and mason jar lanterns waited to cast their warm glow once darkness fell. Georgia stood in the doorway of the kitchen, taking in the scene before her. Volunteers bustled about, arranging flowers and adjusting place settings. The aroma of home-cooked dishes filled the air, her famous cornbread, slow-cooked pot roasts, and an array of comfort foods that had become favorites among their regular guests. "Need any help?" Elliot's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him looking particularly handsome in a navy blazer, his silver hair catching the sunlight. "Just taking it all in," she replied, smoothing her dress, a flowing emerald green number that made her feel beautiful, something she'd never thought possible before meeting him. "Can you believe it's been a whole year?" He stepped closer, placing his hand at the small of her back. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday when you first walked through those doors. Other times—" He paused, his voice softening. "Other times it's like I can barely remember the silence that used to live here." The first guests began arriving as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Veterans from Elliot's entrepreneurship program, widows who'd found community in the kitchen, local families who'd been touched by their outreach. They all came bearing dishes and warm smiles. Mrs. Brigham, who now ran the household with considerably more cheer than before, directed the staff in lighting the lanterns as dusk approached. The mansion's grounds transformed in the growing darkness. Hundreds of twinkling lights strung between trees created a canopy of stars above the tables. The fountain in the center of the garden provided a gentle backdrop of flowing water, and speakers hidden among the shrubbery played soft gospel music. Georgia watched as Elliot moved among the guests, greeting each person by name. Gone was the man who'd hidden in shadows, replaced by someone who reached out to shake hands and didn't hesitate to embrace those who needed it. He stopped to listen to a young veteran's business proposal with genuine interest, then knelt beside an elderly woman's wheelchair to hear about her grandchildren. "He's something else, isn't he?" Mrs. Brigham appeared at George's side, her eyes misting slightly. "I worked here for 15 years before you came, and I never saw him truly smile. Now look at him." Georgia nodded, her heart full. God works in mysterious ways. As the evening progressed, the tables filled with laughter and conversation. Children darted between chairs playing tag, their joy echoing across the grounds. The food was served family style, dishes passed from hand to hand, stories shared over breaking bread. When most had finished their main course, Elliot stood and gently tapped his glass. The crowd fell quiet, all eyes turning to him. Georgia noticed his hand trembling slightly. Public speaking still made him nervous, but his voice was clear and strong. "A year ago," he began, "this house was a museum of memories. I lived here, but I wasn't alive here. This home once belonged to ghosts, but now it belongs to grace." He paused, his eyes finding Georgia's across the sea of faces. Someone taught me that wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the number of lives we touch. Looking around tonight, I see true riches." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. A few people dabbed at their eyes with napkins. "To everyone here," Elliot continued, "thank you for letting us be part of your stories. Thank you for showing me that community isn't just a word. It's a miracle that happens when we open our hearts to each other." The crowd raised their glasses in response. As they did, someone began humming "Amazing Grace." Others joined in, and soon the entire gathering was singing softly, their voices carried on the evening breeze toward the ocean. Georgia felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she sang. Elliot made his way to her side, taking her hand in his. When the final notes faded, he turned to face her fully. His eyes held such tenderness that her breath caught in her throat. He leaned down and kissed her then, not with the desperate hunger of their first kiss in the kitchen so many months ago, but with something deeper. It was reverence, pure and simple, a recognition of the divine thread that had woven their broken pieces into something beautiful. As they parted, Georgia looked up at him, her heart overflowing with gratitude. 8 years he hadn't been touched. 8 years of isolation and guilt and grief. But when he finally was touched, when he finally allowed love to reach him, heaven itself took notice. She could feel it in the gentle breeze that carried the scent of roses, in the soft murmur of conversations around them, in the way the lantern light seemed to dance with joy. Their joined hands rested on the table, surrounded by the family they'd built together. Someone told a joke, and laughter bubbled up from the other end of the table. A child's squeal of delight pierced the air as fireflies began to appear in the gathering darkness. The music played on, a gentle backdrop to the symphony of life that now filled this once silent place. In that moment, Georgia understood that grace wasn't just about receiving mercy. It was about how that mercy transformed you into someone who could offer it to others. She watched as Elliot squeezed her hand gently, his wedding ring catching the lantern light. The simple band was new, but the promise it represented was as old as faith itself. Love heals, hope restores, and grace makes all things new. The evening stretched on, full of faith and laughter, a testament to the power of opening doors that fear had kept locked. The mansion that had once stood as a monument to loss now pulsed with life, its windows glowing with welcome, its halls echoing with joy. And at its heart sat 2 people who had found each other in the midst of their brokenness, their clasped hands a quiet reminder that love's greatest miracle is its ability to make whole what was shattered. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.